Okay.
How's the sound level? Is alright?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
it's all good. It's all good.
alright, okay.
Ready when you are.
Alright.
The very simple rules. Just two. Well, one is no, just
This is fine.
that
Okay.
is fine.
Yeah.
So two very simple rules. Let me introduce you first in front of the
Yeah.
camera.
Yeah.
Just look at the camera for
Okay.
a few seconds, and after that, I'll just turn to you, and then we just start a
We have a
conversation.
chat. Okay.
And then, you sure you want to have water? No.
No. I'm still not fully well from my cough, but
Oh,
I
okay.
think I can talk. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we just look at the camera, and
Alright.
we'll begin in a few seconds. Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News. I'm Robin Steinberg. Welcome to my show again. And here today we have a distinguished author, none other than Dr. Kevin Tan. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Let me restart again. You're not a doctor, right?
I am.
Oh, yes.
I am Doctor Professor whatever. That's
Oh,
not
okay.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Let me. I was just trying to rephrase again. Okay, we'll start one more time. Take two. Okay. Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News. I'm Robin Steinberg. Welcome to my show again. And today we have a distinguished author himself, and that's none other than Dr. Kevin Tan, who is next to me right now today. And we're going to talk about his book that he has written, which is known as The Marshal of Singapore, which is actually the life work biography of David Marshall. And he's one of those distinguished figures in the history of Singapore. And Kevin is going to share with us his insights and his outlook, the way the Marshalls have established and made a profound impact here in Singapore, especially the law. Dr. Kevin, welcome to our show.
Yes. Thank you, Robin.
And I'm amazed that this biography has been compiled finally, after all these years, and it's made available, to all leading bookstores and Amazon online as well. Could you tell us a little bit about your insights of how David Marshall has made a difference here in Singapore?
Sure, but maybe I should start by prefacing by saying that this is actually the third biography of David Marshall. I mean, so important was he in our local political and legal context. The first attempt had actually been done by Alex Josie, but that was a rather small book and comprised mainly of his speeches and so on. Professor Chan Heng Chi, who was at one time head of the political science department, had written another one called Sensation of Independence, which was an excellent biography as well. The difference, of course, in this particular biography was that I was able to bring to it a legal scholar's perspective, because David Marshall, even though most people remember him as being the first Chief Minister of Singapore, was quintessentially a lawyer. I mean, he was a first-rate lawyer, probably the best criminal lawyer, best constitutional lawyer we have ever produced. So that's how I came to write this book and bring with it sort of a legal background to it. And of course, I had access to a lot of sources that had not been available to the authors of the first two editions, the first two volumes. Um,
And about David Marshall himself, in your research and your journey, in creating this volume itself, what were the challenges that you face?
Well, David Marshall is a very complex man. He's a member of the smallest minority in Singapore, the Sephardic Jews. He was born actually David Shaul Mashal. Of course, that got anglicized into David Saul Marshall. And because of his very interesting background, being a member of the minority, also operating in quintessentially a Chinese colonial city, that makes it a very interesting mix. Now, the advantage, of course, of writing a book like this on David Marshall was that it was easy insofar as that the sources were all in English. I didn't have to have to read it in or get translations from Jewish texts or anything like that. So most of the materials would have been in English, and David Marshall was a fairly meticulous record keeper. So one of the challenges I had, compared with some other research projects where you probably have a hard time finding more material. In the case of David Marshall, it was really, mountains of files and materials that one had to plow through to sort of mine it and dig out the gems that could possibly be fit into a book of this size. It's already a huge book. It's about 600 pages. If you wanted to include all the stories that one heard, just the stories and anecdotes alone, I think it would be double the size of this book already.
Wow.
Yeah.
So have you ever wished that you could create a second volume?
Not really. I think I'm quite happy with what I managed to do with this, in the sense that I feel I've managed to sort of get under the skin of the man. I can understand him to the extent that I can write a biography in a fairly sympathetic fashion. Sort of being able to see the world as he saw the world, rather than see the world as as somebody operating in the 21st century. I mean, he was not a 21st century person, right? He had a very, very different view of the world. I mean, don't forget, this was a man who was born before the First World War, all right, who was actually stuck in Iran when his mother had taken them back to visit her parents, and then only began learning English at about the age of 6 or 7, right? So this is a very, very different person from what you would call a normal Singaporean, growing up in the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century.
Now, would you able to describe probably maybe 2 or 3 stories that is not even included in this volume that were interesting to you, but yet you were not able to include it?
Well, all right. David Marshall was a legend in the courtroom, right? And he was a legend not only because of his forensic skills, his ability to cross-examine. He was also able to advance arguments in a very persuasive manner. I mean, if you've ever met the man, you'd be impressed. I mean, David Marshall was one of those persons who, if you were, if he just quietly walked into a restaurant, all eyes would turn. I mean, he had that aura about him.
Wow.
Yes.
Have you met him?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Wow.
And in fact, of course, in the courtroom, he was a master, and not only because of his natural ability, but because of his thorough preparation. But no matter how good a lawyer you are, no matter how much you prepare, David Marshall was amazing in his preparation. I mean, when he had a big trial the next day, for example, he would go to bed at 8 o'clock, and he would get the telephone operator to wake him up at 2, and then he would dress, shave and everything as if he were going to the office, and he would prepare his case. So he'd be preparing his case from 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and he would be in the court by 8 a.m., 2 hours before the court was scheduled to start, and a further 2 hours in pure concentration and preparation. So by the time the trial started, these young DPPs running to court at 9:45 were just waiting to be eaten by David Marshall.
Really?
Yeah, well, because he was so well prepared. He had been at it for 6 hours already. But this one story didn't quite make it in, and this was a case that happened in East Malaysia. Now, in those days, lawyers in Singapore could practice both in West Malaysia as well as East Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak, and so on. And what they would do is that they might get a brief, and David Marshall was actually appearing, I forget now whether it was Sabah or Sarawak, I think it's in Sabah, in the High Court. And he was up against a very formidable opponent, right? Yusofi Abdul Kadir. Yusofi Abdul Kadir, of course, later on became a Supreme Court judge and Federal Court judge in Malaysia. Now, Yusofi Abdul Kadir, like David Marshall, was an astounding advocate. He was very, very fluent, and his mastery of the law was, really, second to none. And so you had 2 of the toughest adversaries facing each other. And like I said, sometimes no matter how good you prepare, how well you prepare, if your case is not very good, you're not going to win the case anyway. And David Marshall had a worse case than he had expected in terms of the facts and the evidence and so on. And he could see that Abdul Kadir was getting the ear of the judge. Right, he was very smooth. He was almost humming in his submissions, and he knew he had to do something to break the rhythm. right? So David Marshall, who was famous for his courtroom drama, right, theatrics, took his wig off and he slammed it on the table, right?
Really?
And
He did that?
yeah, and the judge said, "But, Mr. Marshall, what do you think you're doing?" My lord, he said, "Your wig, what are you doing?" And, beg your pardon, my lord. And he put it back on, right? By that time, he had broken Abdul Qadir's rhythm. And and Abdul Qadir, who is a very meticulous man, did not like surprises. He did not like being interrupted. And of course, that upset him completely. And David Marshall then was able to capitalize on this, and he won the case. So, you get legends like this. I mean, when David Marshall went to court, young lawyers were flocked there just to listen to how he performed, right?
Really?
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
Is there any other lawyer like him today that that could command such an aura?
I have not seen any. I think it's a different world altogether. I mean, don't forget, David Marshall did some of his best work in front of a jury, right? We abolished the jury in 1969, and so the kind of advocacy that takes place in the courts these days is really before a judge, right? And judges, having seen it all, are not going to be terribly impressed with some of these tactics. But that's not to say that David Marshall was not a good, what we call an appeals lawyer, where there is no opponent. You only argue based on your appellate brief, right? There's no cross-examination, no witnesses. I mean, he was paid the highest honor when they said, well, you were able to make the bench hum, in the same way that some of the very best lawyers in England could do. So this is the kind of man he was, and he was not just a very good advocate, but he knew his law very well. His research was thorough. He had these what other lawyers call Bibles, right? These notebooks where he would meticulously annotate all the cases that he thought were relevant to his practice, and therefore he could command and pull together. In the days before the internet, before search engines, right? He could command a lot of data in a very short time because of the way he had organized his own material.
Oh wow!
Right.
That's amazing. Commanding material in a very short time, probably in a library, I suppose.
Well, he had an amazing library, and he had no problem with spending money on books and so on. I mean, David Marshall really cared for his craft. I mean, he was a man who truly believed, number one, in the inherent goodness of law, that law served a noble purpose. I think this is something very important. I may be quite cynical about this, but I think many lawyers today don't see law as something that is a noble calling, but rather it's a profession, it's a job, right? And David Marshall had these values, and that's why he was so dead against the death penalty. I mean, he was absolutely livid whenever there was a death penalty case, and it would make his stomach churn. I mean, I would read his diaries, and you would know, right? He's coming up against a murder case, and he cannot eat. You would need to have a glass of milk because his stomach was just churning away, and he would get so tense, right? He would clench his fists until they bled, right? And that's why he had some of these pieces, and this I didn't know until after the book was out. And the Marshall family, Mrs. Jean Marshall and the children, were very kind. I mean, they liked the book, and they said, look, we'd like to present you a gift from the family. And it was actually a little jade rabbit, right, which I have at home. And Jean Marshall said, look, it's not valuable per se as a jade, but it did belong to David. And he had a number of these pieces, right, because and he liked to buy jade and keep them in his pocket, so that when he got too tense, he would clasp the jade so that it would calm him, so that he wouldn't, clench his fists until they bled.
Huh.
Yeah. So this is a man, a great passion, incredible lawyer, not a very good politician. I think he's not a good politician because, if you want to play politics, you can't be wearing your heart on your sleeve. You've got to keep your cards close to your chest. And he wasn't very good at doing that. I mean, if he felt angry with somebody, he would just, lash out. He would make speeches. He would make sometimes overly extravagant promises that he could keep.
Yeah, he kept them.
That he couldn't keep.
Oh, he couldn't
They
keep.
were extravagant. I mean, to say, for example, in 1956, going for the constitutional talks in London to say, I will get you independence, that was not even possible. I mean, the British would never allow Singapore to become independent. Not at that stage in point.
But he did. Eventually.
But he still promised it, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So this is why,
yeah.
a more astute politician might probably not have done that. Right?
Now, from your experience in encountering with David Marshall and putting this book together in this volume, are there three things that you learned from him that or probably that has inspired you?
Oh, three things.
Yes, as a lawyer.
I think you learn a lot of things from David Marshall, but I think having met the man when I was a law student, we were already immediately bowled over by this man. So it's not really okay. If I have to name three things, I wouldn't say it came as a result of my writing this book. I very much wanted to write this book. It's a commissioned volume. I was asked to write it, but I very much wanted to do it because I had this great admiration for David Marshall. I met him when I was only a first-year law student in NUS, and at that time he had been invited by Tommy Coe to give a talk at the Moot Court, at the old Moot Court in Cambridge, and he was amazing. I mean, he walked in his tall. He's got this wavy, long hair. He looks like a Shakespearean actor. Spoke like one, and you could immediately sense, right, that you were in the presence of somebody of a great stature. And then the first thing he did was he lambasted us, right? He started scolding us and saying that we didn't have enough, guts, we didn't have chili padi in our stomachs, right? That lawyers should not be only concerned with lucre, that you shouldn't have gold dust coursing through your veins. You should have, values. And I looked at this man and I said, this is not some old guy coming and pontificating, right? Just sort of giving words of wisdom. He really believed in everything he said, that you had to stand up for the rights of the underdog. That if something was wrong, it was your duty as a Singaporean to stand up and fight, right? That, causes are worth fighting for, values are worth fighting for. And so, that had a great impact on us. I mentioned this in the preface, in fact, that first time we met him, and later on, of course, when I was writing the book, I actually had the opportunity to look at his diary entry for that day. And much as he impressed us, I think we didn't impress him very much, right? And he said, I think we should give up on politics. These students, they are just apathetic, So that's one thing, right? Commitment to values. The belief that as lawyers you are privileged to be in a position to articulate, to have a voice for those who don't have a voice for themselves. That's the first thing. The second thing was, in the course of meeting him, at that time I was also editor for the Singapore Law Review, which is a student-edited journal. And just as taking a chance, we asked him if he would contribute an article. And he said, yes, he would. Right? And we thought, my goodness, the great David Marshall would give us an article. And he wrote this incredibly funny but very powerful article on legal ethics. Right? The belief that you've got to do things properly, rightly. To have time for law students. I mean, who were we? I mean, we were first, second year law students running around, right? But he always had time for young people, because as far as he was concerned, the young people are the future. Right? So, second important thing, David Marshall. And the third thing I think I learned is, looking at the way he conducted his life, the way he went from legal practice into government service. I think this was something which lesser men would never have done. I mean, David Marshall was Lee Kuan Yew's greatest adversary in the Legislative Assembly, right? I mean, they were the two titans of the assembly, and they never really liked each other in the beginning, right? But David Marshall, when he was asked by Raja Ratnam if he would be ambassador, the first Singapore ambassador to France, he grabbed the chance immediately. He said, finally, I get a chance to serve my country, right? A patriot, I mean, a man who truly believed in Singapore, who believed in the values of Singapore, and who did not have that rancor, that bitterness to say, well, you didn't treat me too well at the beginning, and so, I'm going to exact my revenge. No, he said, look, it's a chance to serve my country, and he did it with great distinction.
And speaking about distinction, how did he manage to balance his work life as well as being a politician and also with his family? It must be a real challenge.
Well, first of all, when David Marshall became a politician, he practically gave up his legal practice. In fact, he had a line which he used to say, I'm probably the only person who went into politics and came out poorer for it.
Really?
Yes. I mean, David Marshall, he was, one of the highest paid criminal lawyers in town. So he had money, right? And when he went into politics, he was happy to spend his own money. He set up something, his own, sort of public advisory bureau, where he would pay for individuals to work for him, to help him out with his meet the people sessions, with communications and all that. David Marshall was not somebody who thought that politics was going to be, something that was very prestigious, or that he's gonna make a big money out of it. No, David Marshall, for him, politics was a calling. It was a responsibility. It was something that needed to be done, and he was prepared to do it, sacrifice or not. So he actually went into politics and lost money. His legal practice practically closed down for that 2 years that he was in government, right? Is there some kind of balance? Well, probably he was also not married at the time. David Marshall married pretty old. He was in his 50s when he got married. So this was, by that time, his political career was over, and he was mainly just a lawyer, and of course a leader in the Jewish community and so on, right?
So when he became a lawyer again,
Yes.
in his 50s, and he got married, as you said.
Oh, well, I think he went back into legal practice fairly quickly after he had stepped down, right? He even harbored ideas of becoming a doctor, actually, and then after reading a couple of books that a psychologist had lent him, he said, no, I think it's too hard to go back to being a lawyer.
So how is life for him being a father to his children?
Well, I think he was like most older fathers, a rather doting sort of a father. He loved his children tremendously, and was in a way quite a liberal as far as fathers go, right? He would engage them in conversation. They would have these debates, so he treated them as grown-ups, right? Notwithstanding the fact that, of course, he was a very, very busy man, but David Marshall was practicing in an era where he could, if he didn't have any cases, get back home by 4:30 or 5 o'clock, right? And then spend time with his children, go to bed early, and then prepare his cases by waking up at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning.
Oh, he still does at his own age?
He did that. He did that all the way till he shut down his practice.
Oh.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to come back to this question, that is how David Marshall became David Marshall himself. Because I read some of his chapters in his book, saying that when he first started out, he started out poor, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, he came from a fairly poor family. Well, the father did well for a while, and then of course with the depression in 1928-29, like most other people, they lost a lot of money. The father was actually a merchant, right? He actually come to Singapore to recuperate, right? He had some illness, and then he was looking for a place to, just basically taking a cruise, and he came to Singapore, and being a businessman, he saw an opportunity. He realized that, when he came to Singapore, it was like the Ramadan period, right? And then he discovered that most of the Muslims here, when they broke fast, they didn't have dates, which was very traditional in Iraq, right, where they came from, right? So he decided that maybe he should, with his contacts, bring dates into Singapore and offer it as as one of these products that they could buy and they could use to break fast, and that's how the family ended up settling in Singapore.
Huh. Now, how did David manage? Well, correct me if the legend is true, but how did actually David started his career as one of the greatest lawyers ever in history of Singapore?
Well, he started off very tough, right? I mean, don't forget he was a minority. I mean, he felt very much a minority, especially when he was studying in England, where he tried, quite often without much success, to find a boarding house, right? Where the Jews were discriminated against. At one point, they thought that he was Indian because he had been out in the sun all day long, and they discriminated against Indians as well. So he had this, you could say, kind of a baggage, right, about being discriminated, and he hated discrimination, throughout his life, right. When he returned to Singapore, he actually didn't much have anyone to employ him, right, because the legal practice was dominated in Singapore at that time by the large European firms. And large, I don't mean really the kind of mega 300-man firm that you see today. Large in those days would have been 5, right, 4 or 5. And they wouldn't take Asian assistants, they seldom did. He had his break with Sir Song Ong Siang, who was the very first local born person to be called to the bar. Right? Of course, he was a great scholar and leader of the Chinese community and the Presbyterians and so on. And Song Ong Siang couldn't take him on as an assistant, but he said, look, I'll give you an office space, right? And you do what you can, and if you earn beyond a certain amount, I'll take a share of that. But otherwise, you run, and that's how he got his first break, right? And so David Marshall didn't start off by wanting to be a criminal lawyer, but because many lawyers didn't want to do criminal cases.
Oh, okay.
Right?
But is it because of his eyes? Because there's one part of the book, or I think if I'm not mistaken, that says that someone said that because of his eyes, he's able to compel.
Well, that's only because later on, right, when he was in the courtroom, I mean, his natural sort of personality shone through. I mean, he had these blazing eyes, right? He could scare the daylights out of a witness, right, just by looking at them, right? I mean, he was a very, very accomplished, practiced speaker, right? His pauses, his crescendo, he can speak in the softest of whisper and and thunder with the loudest of them, all in the course of a trial. So you were almost mesmerized by somebody like that, right?
Now, speaking about mesmerize, how can future lawyers today learn from this man, David Marshall? I mean, what are the key elements that can they take away after reading this book?
Well, I'm not sure.
Probably just one key.
Well, I'm not so sure that. I think really it's about values. I mean, David Marshall, at the end of the day, was a man who represented the practice of law at its most pure, right? The belief that law was something normative, something virtuous, something good, and something that you had to practice with a very high degree of responsibility. And I think that is something which I hope and I wish all lawyers would imbibe as part and parcel of their personalities, not so much as a lesson, but that you go into the courtroom and you try and do your best, but at the end of the day, what are you trying to do? You've got to serve the ends of justice, and in that, the meaning of justice connotes fairness, equality, speaking up for those who don't have a voice. Those are values which I think David Marshall had in abundance, and which I think many lawyers could take a leaf out of.
If you had one wish today, would you ever consider, well, compiling a second volume?
Well, second volume, I think it would not be my highest priority. I think most of the stuff. I mean, it took me 20 months of research to do this book, and I think I managed to pull most of the stuff together. But I think a volume of his greatest speeches would be good. Unfortunately, the kind of speeches that we have, most of them are speeches that he made in formal occasions, right? I would have loved, if those sources were in fact available, to have his closing speeches, his addresses in the courtroom, for I think they would make very, very compelling reading, at least for lawyers.
Well said, Dr. Kevin. And once again, we thank you for coming to the National Critics' Choice to share with us insights and your views on your book that you've written, Marshall of Singapore, a biography. And I think for many generations to come, I think a lot of people are going to appreciate what has been done. Hopefully it'll be available in the e-book as well.
I hope so.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll let my publishers know.
Yes, and this book has been published by ISIS, which is the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and you can get it on Amazon and as well as all leading bookstores around the globe. And I wish to thank you for joining me here at the National Critics' Choice. I'm Robin Stienberg with Dr. Kevin Tund, who is the author, and have a great week ahead. Thank you for joining me once again. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. I hope it works.
Yeah, it serves the purpose. Yep.